Evan Marrow was 14, and he hated the woods behind his house. It wasn't just the darkness. Every forest is dark at night. It was the feeling. This one felt alive. He'd stand at his bedroom window, a thin kid in oversized pajamas, just staring at the wall of towering pines. The branches tangled together like they were hiding secrets, and on cold nights, the wind didn't just blow through them. It breathed. A low, hungry breath that made the hairs on his arms stand up. Sometimes he heard something else. A slow, wet sound, like teeth dragging through meat. A constant rhythmic chewing that seemed to come from just beyond the fence line. His mother, a kind woman always wrapped in a cozy sweater, would laugh it off. "Raccoons, honey," she'd say, her voice warm and dismissive. His father, still in his work shirt with a loosened tie, would just shrug. "It's just the trees settling, son." But Evan knew better. His eyes would stay fixed on the shadows, on the jagged shapes the moonlight couldn't reach. He knew something was out there, watching, waiting. He just didn't know for what. One late autumn evening, the wind howled with a new kind of fury. The back porch light flickered, casting twitching, nervous shadows across the yard. Baxter, their golden retriever, stood rigid at the glass door. His fur was bristled, his body tense, and a low, guttural growl rumbled in his chest. He wasn't barking at a squirrel. This was different. This was fear. Evan slid the door open just a crack, peering into the gusty darkness. At first, there was nothing. Just the wind and the swaying trees. Then a shape shifted. Just at the edge of the light's reach, something moved. It stepped forward, and the flickering porch light revealed it in stuttering, nightmarish flashes. It was tall, impossibly tall. Its limbs were too long, stretched taut like rope about to snap. Its skin was a pale, sickly white, pulled tight over bones that seemed too sharp, too pronounced. Its stomach was hollowed inward, a starving, cavernous pit carved right into its body. But the worst part was its jaw. It hung loose, disconnected, swaying like a broken hinge on a rusty gate. And yet, that awful chewing sound was there, wet and constant, even though its mouth barely moved. Baxter let out a pathetic whimper, backing away from the door, his tail tucked tight between his legs. Evan, however, was frozen. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't tear his eyes away from the thing standing on his patio. The creature lifted one of its long, skeletal arms. Its fingers were like dead, brittle branches. It dragged its nails across the glass of the door. The sound was like a scream made of chalk and sandpaper. Scraw! One long, deliberate stroke, then another, and a third. It tilted its head, its empty black eyes catching the porch light for a split second, shining like polished stones. And then a voice, dry as dust and colder than the night air, spilled from that broken, hanging jaw. Hungry. The word shattered the spell. Evan finally screamed. A raw, piercing sound that tore from his throat. Lights burst on inside the house. He heard footsteps pounding down the hall, his parents' panicked voices calling his name. They rushed to him, pulling him back from the door. But when they looked outside, the creature was gone. The yard was perfectly still, empty. They held him, laughing nervously, brushing his messy hair back from his terrified face. "No more scary movies before bed, okay?" his dad said, his voice trying to be steady. But as they led him away from the door, Kevin looked back one last time. Outside, beyond the empty yard, the trees swayed, and he was sure he saw something moving between them. Later that night, Evan lay awake in bed, staring at his curtained window. The house was silent again, but the fear was a living thing in the room with him. He couldn't shake the image of those empty eyes, that hollowed stomach. He couldn't unhear that scraping sound. And then he heard it again. SCCCCCCCCRRRRP. Slow and deliberate, right against the glass of his bedroom window, 2 floors up. Skiskreprup. 4 long drags this time, not 3. The chewing followed, closer than ever, a wet, gnawing sound just on the other side of the wall. Evan pulled the blanket over his head, curling into a tight ball, his body shaking uncontrollably. The next morning, the world was deceptively bright. Cold sunlight glittered on the frost-covered grass. But the yard was too quiet. Baxter was gone. His bright red collar lay abandoned in the grass, glistening with dew. When Evan's father picked it up, he frowned. It was still warm to the touch. His parents blamed coyotes. They called the neighbors, posted signs, but Evan knew. He walked the perimeter of the yard until he found them. Tracks, leading from their fence straight into the dark woods. The footprints were all wrong. Twisted, unnaturally long, with toes that pointed like claws, pressed deep into the damp earth. It wasn't a coyote. He knew what had taken Baxter, and he knew it was coming back. That night, silence was an enemy. Every creak of the old house, every sigh of the wind, made Evan's heart pound in his ears. He couldn't just wait. With a grunt of effort, he began dragging his heavy wooden dresser across his bedroom floor. The old oak was solid, heavy, and the floorboards groaned under its weight. He shoved it tight against the window, creating a barricade. He sat on his bed, clutching a small flashlight, his knuckles white. He promised himself he would stay awake. He would watch. But exhaustion was a heavy weight, pulling at his eyelids. He must have dozed off, because he was startled awake by a sound. Tap, tap, tap. It was gentle, almost polite. A patient, rhythmic tapping on his window pane behind the dresser. Then came the scraping, louder this time, more frantic, then pounding. The heavy dresser shuddered with each impact. Evan scrambled back against his headboard as the dresser began to slide. Inch by agonizing inch, it screeched across the floor, pushed by an impossible strength from outside. The chewing returned, loud and clear now, right outside the window. And a whisper, thin and reedy, leaked through the cracks in the window frame. Still hungry ... double quotes. The flashlight slipped from Evan's trembling hands and clattered to the floor, its beam spinning wildly across the room before settling on the widening gap between the dresser and the wall. The next morning, his parents found his room in chaos. The window was wide open, the tattered curtains whipping in the freezing wind. The heavy oak dresser was shoved aside, splintered and broken. Deep teeth marks were crushed into the wood, as if something had tried to chew right through it. And Evan was gone. On the floor, a trail of cold, dark dirt and drag marks led from his bed, past the shattered dresser, and straight to the open window. A trail leading out into the world and towards the woods. They screamed his name for days. Search teams combed every inch of the forest, their dogs whining and refusing to go deeper. They found nothing. No sign of Evan. The only thing they ever recovered was the dresser. They found it deep in the woods, miles from the house, snapped apart like brittle bones. Weeks passed. The search was called off. The seasons began to turn toward winter. And then the neighbors started to complain. Strange chewing sounds outside their homes after midnight. Porch lights that would flicker and die. Their dogs would bark and cry all night, scratching at the doors to be let in. Every so often, someone would gather the courage to peek through their blinds. And they would see it. A figure, standing in the shadows of their yard. Too tall, too thin, with a caved-in stomach like a hole where life should be. It just stood there, chewing, endlessly chewing on nothing, still starving, still searching. A whisper would ride the cold wind, a dry, rasping sound that seemed to call to anyone awake enough to hear it. Hungry, deep in the darkest part of the woods, where the search teams never went, something new stirred. In the suffocating blackness between the ancient pines, A pair of small, terrified eyes glimmered. A jaw, not quite right, hung loose. A familiar, boyish voice, now hollow and broken, whispered into the eternal night. So hungry,